David Reynolds sat in his cramped, dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the termination letter in his hands. He had given 22 years of his life to the company, climbing the corporate ladder, making sacrifices, and putting everything else on hold. Now with one email it was all gone. Downsizing, they called it. His skills, once valued, were now deemed replaceable. His phone buzzed, a message from a colleague offering half-hearted condolences, but David didn't reply. What was there to say? For years his career had been his identity, and now stripped of that, he didn't know who he was anymore. The next morning, David walked through the city streets, feeling lost. The bustling crowds, the honking of cars, the towering buildings, it all felt overwhelming. This city, once the symbol of his ambition, now felt cold and indifferent. For the first time in decades, David allowed himself to think of home. He hadn't been back to his small hometown in 20 years, not since his parents passed away. Work had always been his excuse to stay away, but now, with no job and no real reason to remain in the city, he felt an inexplicable pull to return. 2 weeks later, David found himself driving along the familiar country roads, the landscape slowly changing from the concrete jungle to rolling hills and open fields. His heart pounded as he neared his hometown. Everything looked smaller, quieter, and yet it felt oddly comforting. He had spent so many years running from this place, chasing something bigger, something more prestigious. But now, returning here felt like the only thing that made sense. He pulled up in front of the old Reynolds house. It was still standing, though a bit weather-worn, just like the memories of his childhood. Stepping out of the car, David breathed in the crisp country air, a mix of nostalgia and anxiety tugging at him. He walked up the creaky porch steps and sat down on the old swing his father had built. The wind rustled the leaves, and for the first time in years, David felt a strange sense of peace. Over the next few days, David began to explore the town he had long forgotten. He visited the local diner, where the waitress, Mary, recognized him immediately. "David Reynolds, is that you? I almost didn't believe it when I saw you walk in," she exclaimed. "It's been too long." David smiled awkwardly. "Yeah, life got busy," he said, realizing how hollow the words sounded. As he sat at the counter sipping coffee, he overheard a group of teenagers talking about their struggles with school and life. It reminded him of his younger self, the small-town boy with big dreams. That was before life got complicated, before he got caught up in the corporate rat race. Something stirred in him, an old passion he hadn't felt in years. The next day, David decided to visit the high school, where his favorite teacher, Mrs. Fields, had once taught. She had been the one who encouraged him to pursue his dreams, telling him that he had the potential to change the world. As he walked through the familiar halls, memories came flooding back. He learned from the school's receptionist that Mrs. Fields was terminally ill and living in a nearby nursing home. Without thinking twice, David decided to visit her. When he arrived at the nursing home, he found Mrs. Fields in her room, looking frail but still radiating warmth. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "David Reynolds," she said softly, "I always knew you'd make something of yourself." David smiled, feeling a lump in his throat. "I don't know about that, Mrs. Fields. I think I got lost along the way." They talked for hours, reminiscing about the old days, and for the first time in years, David felt like he was reconnecting with a part of himself he had long buried. As they spoke, Mrs. Fields asked him what he was doing now. When he explained that he had lost his job and didn't know what was next, she smiled gently. "David, life isn't about titles or promotions. It's about the difference you make in people's lives. You always had a gift for helping others. Why not use that now?" Her words struck a chord. David had always enjoyed mentoring younger colleagues and helping people find their way. It wasn't just the big city that had made him feel empty. It was the lack of real purpose. He had spent so much time chasing material success that he had forgotten what truly mattered. That night, as David sat on the porch of his parents' old house, he thought about his conversation with Mrs. Fields. The next morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going back to the city. Instead, he was going to stay in his hometown and do something meaningful. He had some savings, enough to get by for a while, and more importantly, he had a plan. David reached out to some of the town's leaders and proposed an idea: a community center where local teenagers could come after school for tutoring, mentorship, and guidance. It would be a place where they could get help with their studies, talk about their futures, and learn life skills, something he wished he had access to growing up. To his surprise, the town was fully supportive. They had been looking for ways to engage the youth and keep them out of trouble, and David's idea was exactly what they needed. Over the next few months, David poured his heart and soul into the project. He worked with volunteers to renovate an old building, turning it into a vibrant, welcoming space for the kids. Word spread quickly, and soon the community center was buzzing with activity. David found himself mentoring the same teenagers he had overheard in the diner, helping them with their homework, listening to their struggles, and offering advice about life. One afternoon, as David was closing up the center, he looked around at the smiling faces of the kids and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent so many years chasing success in the city, but here in this small town, he had found something far more valuable. He wasn't just making a living, he was making a difference. A few months later, Mrs. Fields passed away, but not before David had the chance to tell her about the community center. She had smiled, her eyes full of pride, and told him, "I always knew you'd come back home, David. This is where you belong." As David stood at her gravesite, he thought about the journey that had led him here. He had left home years ago in search of something more, only to realize that what he had been searching for had been here all along. Success wasn't about titles or money, it was about purpose, about making a positive impact on the people around you. David had found his way back home, not just to his hometown but to himself, and in doing so, he had discovered a deeper sense of happiness and fulfillment than he ever thought possible.